Coach Kyle here with a screencast on Level 2 constraints. I highly recommend you watch the video, two screencasts that precede this one. The first one is on the introduction to constraint-based training session design, and the second is on Level 1 constraints. This one, on Level 2 constraints, talks about how Level 2 constraints strengthen and refine skills. That's the primary goal of these. And Level 2 constraints do that by progressively increasing the level of variability. And we'll get into exactly what that means. When we progressively increase the level of variability, athletes, we optimize the learning environment for athletes so that the learning they experience becomes stickier and is more likely to transfer once we get them to a tournament-like situation. So, just like Level 1 constraints should aid the athlete, AID, amplify feedback, invite new movement solutions, and then destabilize, well, Level 2 constraints should offer variation. And then through that variation, they strengthen and refine skills. Now, this variation that we're talking about, it's not just change for the sake of change, like putting a balloon up or changing the distance or the target face size. This is very strategic use of change. There are 4 design structures that a coach can manipulate to increase the level of variability. So those levels are really need to be chosen based on what the motor learning stage of the athlete is. So those 4 structures are block, repeated block, serial, and random. Right? Block is going to be ideal for late cognitive. So Level 1 constraints, you'd be in early cognitive through late cognitive. And then after doing those Level 1 constraints is where you would start to merge into these block style sessions. And then eventually repeated block, once skill and competence was shown at the repeated block level, move on to serial, and then random. So in other words, this isn't a progression, block, repeated block, serial, and random, that you would do in an hour and a half. This might take a month and a half to go through each one of these structures. Let's take a closer look. So practice design, let's discipline the eye over the left-hand column labeled practice design, blocked, repeated block, serial, and random there. And let's just look at example number 1. In blocked, the athlete is task switching between focal points infrequently. So in this case, every 24 arrows, the athlete task switch. So the athlete will focus on the cue for loading, not just, in other words, the coach isn't telling the athlete to go focus on load for 24 arrows. That is not going to capture and direct the attention of the athlete. You need to, as the coach, provide a cue for load that the athlete's going to execute 24 times before moving on to a cue for anchor that they execute 24 times. And these cues would have been developed as a part of going through the Level 1 constraints covered in the other screencast. Now look at repeated block. The task switching between load, anchor, and transfer happen more frequently. So in this case, every 6 arrows. But it could be 3 arrows, it could be 5 arrows. It's just fewer arrows. Then in serial, this really needs to be a task switching every single arrow. In this task switching, the fancy name is contextual interference. That makes it more challenging, and the athlete needs that higher level of challenge as they increase stage of motor learning. It's going to help make this learning stickier. Now in random, this is where the athlete doesn't know what step they're going to focus on next. And they can use a roll the dice app on their phone, or the coach could even call out the focal point as the athlete knocks an arrow. Let's take a look at an example of how this might look in a real life situation. So here's a sample progression of a Level 2 constraint. And some assumptions that we can make looking at this progression is that the focal points we'll see connect with the athlete goals. Imagine that the cue themes you see connect with the athlete interests, and that the athlete has first built skills with Level 1 constraints. So they've already built skills with Level 1, and they're moving into this Level 2 constraint in order to strengthen and refine skills. So let's take a look. Tony is going to dive into this training session here. And this might take a month or a month and a half to go through. And the block session, you can see there's a warm-up there. And for Tony, Tony's going to use the fuselage cue, which is what Tony developed for setup. And that's going to use 12 arrows. So Tony likes airplanes. So for Tony, fuselage is symbolic with aligning skeletal alignment at setup and setting the structure of the airplane, getting it nice and strong. And then for Tony, the cue of airplane taking off, well, Tony pictures their draw side arm as the airplane wing, and that airplane taking off is that slightly uphill motion of the draw force load. And they're going to do that for 12 arrows. And then for anchor, the cue that Tony uses, the analogy, is the airplane climbing to elevation. So that airplane wing, the draw side arm, is going to climb up that, what sometimes we call the escalator angle there, to anchor. And then finally, the airplane's going to level out at transfer. And each one of those is 12 arrows each before moving on, before task switching. Now, when do you move on to repeated block? Well, you want proficiency before you move on. What does that mean exactly? Well, I would recommend 5 out of 6 or 6 out of 6 arrows for any one of those focus points, maybe 3 ends in a row. And when you can do that, you move on to repeated block. Okay? And then on to serial, and then on to random. Again, that whole section might take a month to a month and a half. Always ask yourself, is what we're doing being effective for the athlete? Is it moving them towards their goal? And if it's not, adjust the constraints. I've had athletes where we need to go back from repeated block back to block, or serial back to repeated block. And that's fine. Learning is nonlinear. Does it amplify feedback? Do level 2 constraints amplify feedback? Not like level 1 constraints, where you have cat whiskers on, or the tap connection ball for doing setup. The level 2 constraints don't amplify feedback the way level 1 does. We want the athlete to learn how to do the movements and develop the patterns and positions in level 1 constraints, and then transfer that over to level 2. Is it repetition without repetition? Absolutely. Level 2 constraints are amazing at that. To the untrained eye, it looks like they're just shooting at arrow after arrow, but really, every single arrow has a very specific strategic purpose. Is it representative design level 2 constraints, meaning do they help somebody prepare for a tournament? No, that's not the purpose of level 2 constraints. Level 3 constraints are going to do that. We need to strengthen and refine skills before we dive into representative design. Okay, let's take a look. Well, what about the category of constraint? What did we constrain? Was it the task, the environment, the individual? Well, in this, we're really constraining the task and also the individual. Let's go ahead and do a brief reflection. I recommend that you pause the video here and then consider the answers to the questions. Turn the video back on once you're ready. So, if level 1 constraints build skills, level 2 constraints do what? Well, level 2 constraints strengthen and refine skills. What is the overarching goal of level 2 constraints? To provide variability. Name the 4 design structures you can use to progressively build variation into sessions: block, repeated block, serial, and random. What constraint categories were manipulated in the examples? Well, in this one, task and individual, really. We didn't have any environmental constraints. In what stages of motor learning did level 2 constraints span? Really late cognitive all the way through autonomous. Hope this screencast was helpful, and please reach out if you have any questions.